What's going on, guys? My name is Matt and I am back with a new PC build. This one is going to be an all AMD system and it's going to have a big focus on the case, which is the NZXT H1. Many of you have probably already seen coverage on the H1, but I thought I'd take a shot at building a PC in one to give you my opinion on it. Let's go ahead and talk about the parts in the system, starting with the CPU. This is the Ryzen 5 3600, pretty much the best mid-range gaming and productivity CPU out right now. If all you want to do is game, then going with the new Ryzen 3 3300X might be a better idea, but if you're interested in stuff like streaming or video editing, then I think the Ryzen 5 3600 is the better buy, and it'll perform better in games that can take advantage of more than 4 cores. I just left the 3600 at stock speeds for this build, but it is unlocked so you can overclock it. With 6 cores and 12 threads on AMD Zen 2 architecture, this $175 CPU is a great value for the money, and I can highly recommend it. The motherboard this is going into is the ASRock B450 Gaming ITX/AC, which is one of my favorite AM4 ITX boards on the market. It has all the features we want with the exception of one, which I'll get into later in the video. For RAM, I went with 16GB of this new Team Group Extreme A RGB DDR4 RAM. This is kind of hard to see in this build, but this is some pretty awesome RGB RAM. It has lighting that diffuses through almost all of the module, and here's a better shot of it so you can see it in action. This is 3600 MHz RAM, so it's great for using with Ryzen systems. Also, it's probably the first RAM kit I've done a plastic peel on, which is always satisfying to do. 16GB is plenty for gaming and 1080p video editing. One downside of going ITX is the fact we only have 2 DIMM slots, which limits the system to a max of 2 sticks, and upgrading means we have to remove these sticks to increase capacity. For storage, I went with a single 512GB NVMe SSD from Inland. This is a pretty decent drive, and 512GB is enough for the OS, applications, and a number of games. Having a big SSD like this is a great way to start off a gaming PC because you can always upgrade to more storage in the future. For graphics, I went with an AMD RX 5700. This is a good value for the money and performs really well, as you'll see in the benchmarks. This is the MSI Armor OC model, which is one of the more entry-level 5700s. With 2 fans and a decent sized heatsink, this cooler works well at keeping this card cool, but does get a little noisy at some points. So now let's talk about the NZXT H1, which comes with not just the case, but also a power supply, a CPU cooler, and a PCIe riser. Opening up the H1, we find that it's packaged really nicely with closed cell foam. This is great to see, and honestly, this is probably enough protection to ship a fully built system in. This is a tower style case with 3 vented sides and 1 tempered glass side. Opening up this case requires no tools whatsoever. The front glass just pops off, and so does the vented back panel. These use a push peg and socket mounting system, which works great and is something I'd like to see in more systems in the future. With both panels off, the center U piece slides right off, revealing the internals. This U panel has removable magnet dust filters on both sides, which is a nice touch. In the graphics card area, there's this white box which has all the manuals, brackets, screws, and other accessories. Unscrewing these 2 screws on the CPU side allows the 140mm included AIO to swing out. Finally, pulling off this panel gives us access to the power supply cables and the drive bays. Like I said before, this comes with an included 140mm AIO liquid cooler. It also comes with an NZXT branded 650W 80+ gold rated SFXL power supply. While I'm not normally a fan of bundled components like this, the AIO was specifically designed for this case, and the power supply cables are pre-run, which removes one of the most difficult aspects of building an ITX system. One of the biggest things going for the H1 is the ease of building in it. This is by far the easiest ITX system I've ever built, and while I normally wouldn't recommend a compact ITX PC for a first time builder, I have no problem recommending this because of how simple and straightforward it is. After opening up your H1 and installing the CPU into the motherboard, you can lower it in only after putting in your IO shield. I somehow forgot to put in the IO shield for my build, but that's not a big deal because no one sees the back panel IO anyway. I plugged in all the cables before installing the AIO so I'd have more room to work. Also, NZXT includes the front IO connectors as one single block, which is something every case manufacturer needs to start doing. It doesn't make sense to separate them when every modern motherboard uses the same layout. I next plugged in the included PCIe riser cable and then my RAM. With this done, the liquid cooler could be installed, the door swung shut, and then I secured the AIO bracket with the 2 screws. Next, I popped the GPU into place, reinstalled the panels, and was ready to fire this guy up for the first time. The H1 is a tower style case, so all your cables are plugged in at the bottom and routed to the back like this. The only exception is the power supply, which has an extender that directly plugs in from the back. This layout is somewhat inconvenient for plugging in cables, but for most people it should be fine. The front panel I/O has a USB-C, USB 3, and mic/headphone combo port. My motherboard doesn't have a USB-C header on it, but if you're getting this case, I would highly recommend getting a board with one so you can take full advantage of the front panel I/O. In terms of looks, I like the mesh look of the 3 side panels, but honestly don't care for the tempered glass panel. I would have much preferred another mesh panel, or even better, a wooden mesh panel like this guy is advertising on r/small form factor PC. Something I also think would be a cool replacement to this panel is a panel with feet, because honestly I like the way the H1 looks laying down a lot. Also, if NZXT made a version like this, they could cut out the bottom part that makes room for the cables and make the overall volume of this guy even smaller. Overall, the H1 is a really good case and is a great example of a mainstream case manufacturer actually paying attention to what ITX PC builders want. While I'm not the biggest fan of the windowed panel, I don't think it looks bad, and overall I think the H1 looks great. The H1 is expensive at $350, but for a high quality 650 watt SFX PSU, PCIe riser, 140mm AIO liquid cooler, and a premium ITX case, $350 is competitive to other offerings on the market. I tested the system in a number of different games to see how it would perform. In terms of noise, I wouldn't call the system quiet, it's definitely audible, but I wouldn't call it annoyingly loud either, and is what I would normally expect from an ITX system. In terms of temps, while gaming, the graphics card stayed in the low to mid 70s, which is acceptable. For some reason, MSI Afterburner didn't give me the option to see CPU temps, so testing the CPU under full synthetic load, I was seeing the temps peak at around 47 degrees, which is really good to see. Keep in mind, both the CPU and GPU are at stock settings, and the CPU definitely has plenty of cooling headroom for overclocking. So with that stuff done, let's go ahead and move on to the benchmarks. Starting off with COD Warzone at 1080p high settings, the system performed well, averaging around 130 FPS. This was a very smooth experience, and getting up to 144 FPS might be possible by dropping some of the settings. Next up is Doom Eternal. I tested this game at 1080p high settings and saw an overall average of around 150 FPS. Again, this was a very smooth experience, and overall I'm happy with the system's performance in this game. Now let's move on to CSGO at 1080p Pro settings, which is pretty much everything set to low. This system put out an overall average of around 300 FPS. This was a smooth experience, and the system is very overkill for a game like CSGO. Next up is Rainbow Six. I used the built-in benchmark at 1080p high settings. The system produced an overall average of 267 FPS, which is great to see. Finally, I tested Fortnite at 1080p Pro settings, which stayed around the 200 FPS mark most of the time. This was a smooth and enjoyable experience. Performance on the system is great, and the combo of the 3600 and 5700 is a great pair for 1080p high refresh rate gaming. So now that you've seen the system and how it performs, let's go ahead and talk about some final things. Overall, this build is great. The parts are well balanced, and the NZXT H1 was amazing to build in. I think the H1 is a solid offering that commands a justifiably high price tag. Overall, I can highly recommend any of the parts featured in this video, and I'll have links to all of them in the description. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below, and I will try to get to as many as I can. So yeah guys, I think this wraps this video up. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to subscribe for more content, and this is Matt from Tech by Matt, signing out.